has been kind of intense for our family. I guess you've read about it in the newspapers or seen it on TV, but we've gone through a lot of trials, and it's been because of the poor choices of our oldest son, Josh. The good news is that through all these trials, God has really drawn our family very close together. And I want to tell you, God's principle.
There is a legal situation developing in the Duggar case that is so tangled and so ethically compromised that it deserves its own full breakdown, and it starts with a name, Travis Story. The attorney who is currently representing both Kendra and Joseph Duggar in their Arkansas case, the same attorney who represented Josh Duggar at his federal trial, and the same attorney who Josh Duggar is now telling a federal court was ineffective, incompetent, and violated his constitutional right to effective assistance of counsel. And I want you to sit with the extraordinary absurdity of that for a moment, because what we have here is Bob Duggar paying for one attorney to represent multiple family members in multiple cases simultaneously, while one of those family members is actively filing legal documents in federal court saying that attorney failed him so completely that his entire trial was compromised. And yet Bob is still using that same attorney for Joseph and Kendra's case, which tells you everything about how Bob Duggar makes decisions, not based on what is best for his children legally, but based on loyalty, control, and the fact that Travis Story has ties to the IBLP world that Bob operates in. Meaning Bob will not work with anyone he cannot trust to operate within his framework, and that preference for loyalty over competence is going to cost Joseph and Kendra in ways they do not yet fully understand. Now, let me walk you through what Josh filed, because it is a 110-page document plus a 54-page response, and it is a genuinely fascinating look into the mind of a malignant narcissist who is sitting in federal prison and refusing to accept any personal responsibility for why he is there. And the core argument Josh is making is that his trial attorneys, which included Justin Gendelman from Missouri as lead counsel and Travis Story as local Arkansas counsel, were so ineffective that the entire adversarial process broke down and he was denied his Sixth Amendment right to effective assistance of counsel. And Josh lists a series of specific failures that he claims his attorneys committed, and I want to go through them, because each one tells you something important about how Josh Duggar thinks and how little he understands about the law. Josh claims his attorneys failed to preserve the core defense by allowing the trial court to exclude evidence implicating alternative purposes. But here's the problem with that argument. Attorneys do not allow courts to do anything. They can ask and advocate and argue, but the judge decides. And Josh's framing of this as his attorneys allowing the exclusion reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of how a courtroom works. Josh claims his attorneys failed to challenge perjured expert testimony from James Fottrell, a federal agent who Josh accuses of altering forensic evidence and lying under oath about the examination of his computer. And this is simply not true. The defense did provide a rebuttal witness and did advance an alternative theory. It just did not work because the forensic evidence against Josh was overwhelming. It was not circumstantial. It was tied to him specifically through data timestamps showing he was present on that computer at that exact time, through selfies he took at that time, through his Crocs appearing in images, through a complete forensic chain that left no room for reasonable doubt, and no attorney in the world was going to overcome that evidence, because the evidence was what it was. Josh claims his attorneys failed to suppress a fabricated confession and allowed the government to build its case around an unrecorded, uncorroborated statement. And here Josh is reaching back to the 2015 statement that was posted on the Duggar family's own website and Facebook page, where Josh admitted to leading a double life, having an addiction to adult content, and being unfaithful to his wife. And Josh is now claiming that statement was made under duress, was false, and tainted the jury pool for 6 years before his trial, which is one of the most legally confused arguments imaginable, because pretrial publicity as a legal concept refers specifically to statements made by attorneys that could taint a jury pool, not to a public statement made voluntarily by the defendant himself 6 years before an indictment. And the fact that Josh and his team are advancing this argument tells you about the quality of the legal thinking going into this appeal. Josh also claims there was a structural conflict of interest because the same judge who presided over his criminal trial was simultaneously handling civil litigation involving him, but that civil case was dismissed, and Josh had no role in it. And he is essentially trying to drag his sister's civil case into his criminal appeal, which is both legally irrelevant and genuinely disturbing, because it means Josh Duggar is using his sisters, the people he victimized, as legal props in an attempt to escape the consequences of what he did to others. And that is one of the most revealing things about who Josh Duggar is as a person. Now, I want to be clear about my own assessment of Travis' story. I do not think Travis was ineffective in Josh's case in the legal sense that Josh is arguing. I think he did what he could with an impossible hand, because the evidence was so overwhelming that no defense strategy was going to overcome it. But I do think Travis is a problematic attorney for very different reasons. Specifically, that he is not primarily a criminal defense attorney, that criminal law and civil law require fundamentally different expertise, and attorneys who try to do everything tend to do nothing particularly well. And most significantly, that representing both Kendra and Joseph Duggar in a case where their interests are directly and fundamentally opposed to each other is a profound ethical violation that is going to hurt both of them, and specifically is going to hurt Kendra the most. Here is why that matters so much. In a child welfare case involving two parents where one parent has confessed to sexually assaulting a child, the standard and ethical approach for competent legal representation would be for each parent to have their own independent attorney, and Kendra's independent attorney would be working to establish her as the non-offending parent, would be negotiating with prosecutors for a deal where she cooperates and testifies and gets her charges reduced or dropped, in exchange for providing information about Joseph, would be advising her to separate from Joseph immediately and demonstrate to DCFS that she is choosing her children's safety over her marriage, and would be building the strongest possible case for Kendra to regain custody of her children. But none of that can happen when the same attorney represents both of them, because everything that would help Kendra hurts Joseph and vice versa. And Travis' story cannot advocate for both of their interests simultaneously. It is legally and ethically impossible, and the fact that he is doing it anyway tells you that the interests being served here are not Kendra's and Joseph's, but Jim Bob's, because Jim Bob needs them to stay together and stay silent and present a unified front. And having them share an attorney ensures exactly that. Now, Arkansas law does allow two co-defendants to share an attorney. The state cannot force them to have separate counsel, but the attorney has an ethical obligation to advise them of the conflict of interest and recommend they obtain separate representation. And the fact that Travis has not done that, or, at minimum, has not done it effectively enough for Kendra to act on it, is where the ethical failure lies, and Kendra's profound ignorance of the legal system, which is itself a product of the educational neglect she was subjected to throughout her entire upbringing in the IBLP world, means she is almost certainly not equipped to assess whether the advice she is being given by Travis is actually in her best interest or in Jim Bob's best interest. And those are two very different things. Now, let me get to the children, because what has emerged in the last several days about the conditions those children were living in goes beyond what has been publicly reported, and it is deeply disturbing. And specifically, there is new information about one of the children that reveals a pattern of deliberate deception by Kendra that reframes the neglect charges against her in a very significant way. Sources say that one of Joseph and Kendra's children, a child of school age, was still in diapers. And when people around Kendra began noticing this and asking questions, Kendra told them that the child had a developmental disability and that the disability was the reason the child had not been potty trained. And this explanation was accepted initially because it seemed plausible, and because people in this community are not generally going to challenge a mother's assessment of her own child's developmental status. But the story began to fall apart when people who knew the family started observing this child more closely and realized that the child appeared to be completely typical developmentally, with no signs of the disability Kendra was claiming. And when they pushed back and offered to help Kendra work with the child on potty training, they would make progress, and then there would be regressions. And eventually, the people around Kendra pushed hard enough that Kendra was required to take the child to a doctor to be evaluated. And when the child was evaluated by a medical professional, the assessment was that there was no disability, that the child was developmentally typical, and that there was no medical or developmental explanation for why the child was not potty trained at school age, other than the child simply not having been trained. And I want you to understand what this means. Kendra was not just failing to potty train her child, she was actively constructing a false narrative to explain and justify that failure. She was telling people her child had a disability that did not exist in order to avoid accountability for the neglect, and that is not the behavior of an overwhelmed mother who is struggling and needs support. That is the behavior of a parent who knows what she is doing is wrong and is deliberately creating a cover story to prevent people from seeing the truth. And it has chilling implications for how we should understand the other choices that were made in that household. And think about what it says about the IBLP world that Kendra was operating in. When she told people her child was disabled, not a single person in her immediate community suggested she get services for the child. Not a single person suggested early intervention, or physical therapy, or occupational therapy, or speech therapy, or any of the resources that exist specifically to help children with developmental disabilities. Because in the IBLP world, disability is not a medical condition requiring treatment and support. It is at best an inconvenience, and at worst, a spiritual problem. And the idea of navigating the medical system and the special education system to get services for a disabled child would have been completely foreign and even threatening to Kendra because those systems involve contact with the outside world, with government agencies, with professionals who would ask questions and observe conditions in the home and potentially report what they saw. And that kind of outside contact was exactly what Joseph and Kendra had been systematically eliminating from their lives in the months leading up to his arrest. Now I want to address the comparison that keeps coming to mind when I think about what was happening in that house. The Turpin family case, where parents locked their children in rooms, barely fed them, provided no education, lived their own comfortable lives while their children existed in conditions of profound deprivation and imprisonment, and were ultimately convicted of torture, abuse, and child endangerment. And the parallels to what is being described in the Duggar home are striking and disturbing, because what sources describe is Kendra spending significant time with Joy Duggar Forsyth, listening to podcasts, presenting herself as a kind of independent-minded mom boss, while her children were locked in rooms in diapers in a house that smelled so badly of urine and bodily fluids that neighbors could detect it from outside. And the cognitive dissonance of that, the gap between the self-image Kendra was constructing and the reality those children were living, is one of the most heartbreaking aspects of this entire story. And Joseph's role in all of this cannot be minimized or explained away by pointing to Kendra's Hashimoto's or her brainwashing or her disconnection from reality, because Joseph was the one who confessed to sexually assaulting a 9-year-old child. Joseph was the one who allegedly kept Kendra sick and depleted and pregnant to maintain control over her. Joseph was the one who isolated the family from everyone who might have helped or intervened. Joseph was the one who introduced the practice of locking children in rooms. And Joseph was the one who created the conditions in that household that resulted in 4 children being removed by DCFS and placed in foster care, where neighbors noted they seemed almost relieved to finally be getting the care and attention they had been starved of. And the question of whether both of them should be facing more serious charges than Class A misdemeanors in Arkansas is one that the legal community and the public are going to be asking increasingly loudly as more details about the conditions in that home come out. Because what is being described sounds much closer to the level of abuse and imprisonment that carries felony charges in many states. And the fact that Arkansas law as currently written results in these charges being classified as misdemeanors says something important about the gap between what the law provides and what justice actually looks like for those 4 children. The bottom line is this: Josh Duggar is in federal prison arguing that the attorney Jim Bob paid for failed him. Joseph and Kendra are heading to their arraignment on the 29th, being represented by that same attorney who has an irreconcilable conflict of interest in representing them both. Kendra allegedly fabricated a disability story to cover up her failure to care for her school-aged child. The children are in foster care, showing signs of profound neglect and developmental delay that are the direct result of years of parental failure. Joy and Austin Forsyth are under their own scrutiny, with DCFS having visited their home and the community watching closely, and Jim Bob Duggar is at the center of all of it, paying the bills, controlling the legal strategy, and doing everything in his power to ensure that the circle of accountability stops before it reaches his door. And the only thing standing between him and that accountability is the growing number of people who are done being silent.